Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. Today we're taking our first look at AMD's new Radeon RX 7600 XT, which is basically just an RX 7600 with a 16GB VRAM buffer, so it probably could have and maybe should have just been called the RX 7600 16GB. But I suppose at least it's not an inferior product with the same name. I know the bar's set pretty low, but we have seen some pretty dodgy stuff over the years. Anyway, I'm keen to see what a 16GB 7600 has for us, but before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by ASUS and their latest range of Z790 motherboards supporting 12th, 13th and 14th generation Intel Core processors. For those of you seeking a budget-friendly option, one of our favourite Z790 motherboards is the Tough Gaming Z790 Plus, available in either DDR4 or DDR5 variants with and without Wi-Fi. There's also the recently updated version called the Tough Gaming Z790 Pro, featuring DDR5 exclusively. But for those of you seeking something a bit more high-end, we've tested a number of excellent Z790 Strix boards, and for my personal gaming system, I'm using the ROG Strix Z790F Gaming Wi-Fi, which packs loads of USB 3 ports, PD 3.130 watt charging, and a powerful V-Core VRM using 16 90-amp power stages. And right now, for Australian viewers, you'll receive a free Corsair Vengeance RGB 32GB DDR5 6000CL36 memory kit when you purchase select ASUS Z790 motherboards with an ASUS all-in-one liquid cooler. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so as I've already said, the 7600 XT is basically just a 7600 with twice as much VRAM, and that's true. The only other change though is a very minor 4% boost to the core clocks from 2655 MHz to 2755 MHz. And this is something you can manually do on any 7600, so it's hardly a unique feature of the 7600 XT. So like the 7600, the new XT model packs 2048 cores with 128 texture mapping units and 64 ROPs. There's also 32 RT cores, 2MB of L2 cache and 32MB of L3 cache. Apart from the memory capacity, the memory subsystem is the same. So that means the 7600 XT uses a 128-bit wide memory bus with 18 gigabits per second memory for a bandwidth of 288 gigabytes per second. And what all this means is, in order to double the VRAM capacity, AMD had to go with a clamshell design, like what Nvidia did with the 16GB RTX 4060 Ti. However, whereas Nvidia charged a $100 premium for the extra memory, AMD is charging a $60 premium, taking the MSRP from $270 for the RX 7600 to $330 US for the 7600 XT. So I think a question potential buyers will ask is the 7600 XT worth the extra $60 US over the standard model? And I suspect addressing that question will be very difficult, as measuring the improvements offered by 16GB of VRAM can be difficult, and for a few reasons. Firstly, even once you're able to find a game that exceeds 8GB of VRAM, and there are plenty of examples out there now, it's not always obvious that there's a problem when watching the frame rate counter. Most games avoid performance-related issues by simply not loading the textures that can't be stored in the graphics memory, resulting in a visual downgrade with stuff like blurry-looking textures, missing details, or bad pop-in. And for game developers, this is preferable, as the alternatives, which would include stuff like crashing or unplayable performance, they simply result in an angry customer. And you know, most gamers, they're not going to be blaming a lack of VRAM. Still, we have seen examples where performance tanks and games even crash, but this is a less common occurrence when running out of VRAM. The point is, simply benchmarking an 8GB and 16GB graphics card and looking at the FPS counter, it doesn't tell you the whole story, so be aware of that as we go over the numbers. And if you want a visual comparison of how 8GB and 16GB memory buffers compare in modern games, then I suggest checking out my 16GB RTX 4060 Ti review, as the rules that applied there also apply here. There's not too much point redoing all of that testing, because as I said, the results apply to all 8GB and 16GB graphics cards. Now for testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory, using the latest display drivers. All data has been validated and updated for this video, and in total I've tested 12 games, some with and without ray tracing, and the resolutions of focus for this review will be 1080p and 1440p. Okay, let's take a look at what we've got. First up, we have Resident Evil 4, and at 1080p, we're looking at a surprisingly large 16% uplift for the 7600 XT over the standard 7600, making it just 6% slower than the RTX 4060. So that's a really good improvement, and it would appear as though the extra VRAM is coming in handy here. Oddly though, the margin is reduced to 9% at 1440p, suggesting that there are other limitations hitting the Navi 33 GPU harder than VRAM capacity. In any case, the 7600 XT is now able to match the RTX 4060 with 71 FPS on average. Moving on to A Plague Tale Requiem, we see that at 1080p, the 7600 XT is just 3% faster than the 7600, so the difference here purely being that factory overclock. But that does mean that the 7600 XT is now 11% faster than the RTX 4060. Then when jumping up to 1440p, we see that the 7600 XT is just 2% faster than the standard model, and 6% faster than the RTX 4060, so similar performance across the board there. Probably something to keep an eye on as we go over all of these results is the 6700 XT, which currently costs $330 US, so the same price as the 7600 XT. And here we see that the newer Radeon GPU is 24% slower, so that's certainly not good. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, and here we're looking at a mild 8% uplift for the 7600 XT over the 7600, making the XT model 6% faster than the RTX 4060. We're also looking at a 6% uplift for the 6700 XT at 1440p, making it 8% faster than the RTX 4060, though it was also 7% slower than the 6700 XT. Performance in Dying Light 2 is much the same, as here we find a mere 2% uplift when going from the 7600 to the new XT model, and with 96 FPS on average, it matched the RTX 4060 exactly. And it's a similar story at 1440p. Here the 7600 XT was good for 63 FPS on average, which was one more frame than that of the 7600, but one less than the RTX 4060, and a lot less than the 6700 XT. In fact, it was 17% slower than the previous generation GPU. The performance uplift in Watch Dogs Legion at 1080p is a little better, but not exactly mind-blowing. We're getting a 6% boost here, though that does make the 7600 XT 9% faster than the RTX 4060. Jumping up to 1440p doesn't change the margins. The 7600 XT is still just 6% faster than the standard 7600. It's also 11% slower than the 6700 XT, so that's quite a disappointing result. The 7600 XT was able to provide an additional 10% performance in Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p, averaging 114 FPS, which meant it was 13% faster than the RTX 4060 and just 3% slower than the 6700 XT. And that additional VRAM becomes even more useful at 1440p, and now the 7600 XT is 13% faster than the standard 7600 and a massive 22% faster than the RTX 4060. Warhammer 3 isn't a very demanding title when it comes to VRAM, at least not by modern standards, and as such 8GB of VRAM is more than enough. And therefore the 7600 XT only has its core clock to fall back on, providing a mere 3% performance increase when compared to the 7600. Then at 1440p it's just 2% faster with 55 FPS on average, so basically the same performance as the RTX 4060. Moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, we're looking at more of the same here. Just a 5% increase for the 7600 XT over the standard model, which means the XT is 13% slower than the RTX 4060. Increasing the resolution to 1440p actually reduces the already small margin, and now the XT is offering a mere 3% uplift, though now it is just 6% slower than the RTX 4060. Next up we have Hogwarts Legacy, and again at 1080p, the 7600 XT is 5% faster than the 7600, as well as the RTX 4060. And then jumping up to 1440p, it shows a mere 4% increase, though that was enough to lead the RTX 4060 by double digits, now offering 13% greater performance. Halo Infinite is an interesting title to include in this video because it's a great example of how difficult it is to test VRAM capacity. For example, using the ultra quality preset does require more than 8GB of VRAM, and yet the 7600 XT is just 2% faster than the 7600. However, this game doesn't suffer a performance hit when played with insufficient memory, rather textures just go missing, and we've shown the difference between 8GB and 16GB GPUs multiple times in the past. The missing texture problem is even more noticeable at 1440p, But again, when looking at the frame rate counter, you'll almost see no difference between the 7600 XT and 7600. The Last of Us Part 1, on the other hand, does suffer a performance hit when running out of VRAM. At 1080p, the 7600 XT is 20% faster than the 7600 and a massive 58% faster when comparing 1% lows. So the increased VRAM capacity is of massive benefit here, even at 1080p. Then at 1440p, the 8GB cards are a stuttery mess in the area of the game we use for testing. The 7600 XT solves this, and while the frame rates aren't amazing, suboptimal I'd say, the game is certainly still playable at 47 FPS. Finally, we have Hitman 3, and here the 7600 XT is offering a decent 10% performance uplift, hitting 142 FPS opposed to 129 FPS with the standard 7600. That also made it a massive 30% faster than the RTX 4060. Then at 1440p, we're still looking at a 10% improvement for the XT over the standard model, which meant it was 28% faster than the RTX 4060. Now, one downside to adding more VRAM is power usage, and we see that here in Hitman 3, where total system usage was increased by 16%. That means when compared to the RTX 4060, total system usage is 33% greater, but the 7600 XT was 28% faster in this test, so performance per watt ends up being pretty similar. That said though, efficiency is much worse in a game like Spider-Man Remastered, as here the 7600 XT pushed total system usage 33% higher than that of the RTX 4060, while delivering 6% less performance, so that's not great. Okay, so now it's time to go over the 12 game average data, and we'll start with the 1080p results. Here the 7600 XT was on average 8% faster than the standard 7600, and 6% faster than the RTX 4060, so about what you'd probably expect to see across a range of games. Then at 1440p, the 7600 XT was just 5% faster than the 7600 when comparing the average frame rate, but a much more substantial 19% margin can be seen when comparing 1% lows. So that's an impressive set of results for the 7600 XT, though it was also 12% slower than the 6700 XT. Now, although I didn't bother going over the 4K data, as this isn't really a 4K GPU, I do have the data, so let's take a quick look at the 12 game average. Here the 7600 XT was 9% faster on average and 25% faster when comparing 1% lows. It also blew the RTX 4060 out of the water, increasing the average frame rate by 23%. Next, we're going to take a look at ray tracing performance, and we'll start with Resident Evil 4. Using the ray tracing quality preset at 1080p, the 7600 XT was really no faster than the 7600, making it 18% slower than the RTX 4060, which is a disappointing result. A Plague Tale Requiem, though, kills 8GB GPUs when using the ultra quality preset with ray tracing enabled. The 7600 is completely unusable, and the RTX 4060 is really no better. The 4060 Ti 8GB looks okay based on the 41 FPS average frame rate, but the 1% lows reveal just how poor the experience is. The fact that the 1% lows of the 7600 XT are 56% greater is one thing, but it's the discrepancy between the 1% lows and the average frame rate that really tell the story. For example, there's a 43% margin between the 1% lows and the average frame rate for the 7600 XT, but a 128% difference for the 8GB 4060 Ti. Still, the 7600 XT is pretty slow here, so you will have to use upscaling, which frankly sucks in terms of visual quality at 1080p. Doesn't really matter if it's FSR or DLSS. All upscaling techniques are pretty bad at 1080p, so you would probably be better off just disabling ray tracing altogether, at which point the 8GB models are perfectly fine. Now, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty has been tested using the ray tracing medium preset at 1080p, and despite that, frame rates are very low on these more entry-level GPUs. Even the RTX 4060 was good for just 38 FPS on average, and again, using DLSS to boost performance isn't an optimal solution, given how poor upscaling quality is at 1080p, and likewise, frame generation also doesn't work very well when the base frame rate is just 38 FPS, so there's no good fix for this. The 7600 XT was 17% faster than the 7600, but also 26% slower than the RTX 4060, so while ray tracing support on the GeForce GPU is questionable here, it's completely useless on the Radeon GPUs. Spider-Man Remastered has been tested using the high-quality preset with high-quality ray tracing, and at 1080p, the performance is excellent. The 7600 XT spat out 104 FPS on average, which is great, though it's really no better than the standard 7600. This also meant that it was 17% slower than the RTX 4060. The 7600 XT fell just short of 60 FPS in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, using ray tracing with the Epic Quality preset, making it just 5% slower than the RTX 4060. It was also 10% faster than the standard 7600, but also 11% slower than the 6700 XT. Finally, we have Fortnite, and the Epic Quality settings with hardware ray tracing enabled is a bit too much for the 7600 XT, as it was good for just 35 FPS on average. A 9% increase from the 7600, but 20% slower than the RTX 4060. Okay, so across the 6 games tested, the 7600 XT was on average 30% faster than the standard 7600, or a massive 64% faster when comparing the 1% lows. So that's a serious performance uplift there by simply doubling the VRAM, but of course, as we saw in examples such as a Plague Tale Requiem, that was the difference between playable and completely unplayable performance. Still, despite having just 8GB of VRAM, the GeForce RTX 4060 was faster overall, delivering 13% greater performance on average, though the 1% lows were much the same. Also, something worth noting is the fact that the Arc A770 was as fast or typically faster than the 7600 XT across these ray tracing titles, making it not just more affordable, but also better for ray tracing. Now it's time to check out the cost per frame data, and of course we will start with an MSRP comparison. Sadly, with an extra $60 US tacked onto the price, the 7600 XT is much worse value than the original 7600, increasing the cost per frame based on our 1440p data by 17%. That said though, the added benefit of doubling the VRAM, it's not always realized in these benchmarks, as I noted in Halo Infinite for example. So the fact that the 7600 XT and RTX 4060 represent similar value in terms of cost per frame, in games like Halo, the 7600 XT can enable a much higher visual experience simply because it can load all required textures. Moreover, if you want 16GB from the current NVIDIA lineup, you have to buy the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, which is only 20% faster than the 7600 XT, despite costing nearly 40% more, and that's at the new $450 US MSRP. Anyway, MSRPs don't always reflect real-world pricing, so let's take a look at the current retail prices. Right, so in the current market, the 7600 XT doesn't look great, and that's because for roughly the same money, you can buy the 6700 XT, which still packs 12GB of VRAM, but was on average 13% faster. And perhaps worse still is the RX 6800, which is a 16GB graphics card, and although it currently costs 27% more, it's also 42% faster, and much more usable in situations where you want to enable ray tracing. There's also Intel's Arc A770, which packs 16GB of VRAM for just $300, making it better value than the 7600 XT. Now, before wrapping things up, let's quickly take a look at some custom board partner designs. And please note, there isn't a reference model version of the 7600 XT. The model I use for testing is Sapphire's Pulse, a reasonably compact dual-fan model that's powered by dual 8-pin PCIe power connectors, though sadly it doesn't support dual BIOS functionality. For testing, it was installed inside an ATX case with a room temperature of 21 degrees and was placed under gaming load for an hour. After an hour, the junction temperature peaked at 69 degrees with a GPU hotspot temperature of 87 degrees, and this was achieved with a fan speed of just 1300 RPM. So a very impressive result. The memory also peaked at 86 degrees, which is acceptable, and clocked at 2238 MHz, with the cores typically operating at 2595 MHz. Also on hand for testing is the XFX Speedster Quick 309 7600 XT, which is a much larger, higher-end looking model, but also the Quick 308 RX 7600 is an MSRP model available for $270 US. So it's quite possible that the Quick 309 will also be an MSRP model selling for $330 US. And if so, it's a very impressive model for that price, packing dual BIOS support, a triple fan cooler, massive heatsink, and a full aluminium backplate. And performance-wise, it's very good. The junction temperature peaked at 62 degrees, and the hotspot hit 83 degrees, so both slightly less than that of the Sapphire Pulse, though the fan speed was also slightly higher at 1600 RPM. We also saw a similar memory temperature at 85 degrees, with the big difference here being the operating clock speed, as the core's typically clocked at 2750 MHz, and that's 6% higher than that of the Sapphire model, so a good result there for XFX. Then finally we have the Gigabyte Gaming OC 7600 XT, and these Gaming OC models have been a bit hit and miss lately. This 7600 XT version, for example, it does look quite good. It's a relatively large model with a triple fan cooler, the heatsink is very big, and it includes a full-size aluminium backplate. Sadly though, it was quite loud with a fan speed of 2000 RPM, and despite that the operating temperatures weren't amazing. Sure, the junction temperature of 56 degrees was good, but the GPU hotspot still hit 84 degrees, a degree higher than that of the XFX model. The memory temperatures though, they were pretty good, peaking at 78 degrees, and that's a 7-degree improvement from the Speedster Quick 309. So overall, it is a decent product, but without dual BIOS support for something like a silent BIOS, it's not the most optimal out-of-the-box experience, and temperatures will likely suffer when turning the fan speed down from 2000 RPM to something more suitable like 1600 or even 1300 RPM. Okay, so there you have it, AMD's new Radeon RX 7600 XT. We've just looked at a heap of benchmarks. What do we actually make of this thing? I think it's fair to say that evaluating a product like this is a bit difficult because the cost per frame data doesn't necessarily tell the full story, and that's because the frame rate, it's not always an apples-to-apples comparison like what we see in Halo Infinite, for example. Although two cards can be producing similar FPS numbers, the resulting image quality can be quite difficult. So yeah, not apples-to-apples data, and we absolutely hate that. Unfortunately, because of the way most games handle insufficient VRAM, you have to carefully analyze stuff like image quality. But even then, it can be difficult as many games will require you to play them for extended periods of time in order to fill the VRAM buffer. Halo, for example, can take 15 to 30 minutes before the 8GB cards run into trouble, and when they do, the FPS counter, it's none the wiser. Rather, you'll notice blurry textures and missing details. Without question though, 16GB of VRAM is much better than 8. But also, the Navi 33 GPU, it's not super powerful, so you're less likely to be running at resolutions and quality settings that will saturate an 8GB buffer. Though of course you still can, and it certainly does happen, but how often will depend on the games you play. There's also the future games angle. How well is an 8GB 7600 going to age over the next few years when compared to the 7600 XT? Probably not that well, despite the fact that these are lower end GPUs. And as an example, the 8GB version of the RX 580 works significantly better than the 4GB model using medium to low quality settings in modern games. And in fact, you can turn the textures up for a much higher quality presentation. So naturally, we can expect the same thing to happen with 8GB versus 16GB graphics cards, and we'll probably see that come to light over the next few years. Of course, we already are seeing examples of this, but I expect it to be much more commonplace in the near future. I think a $60 US premium for an extra 8GB of VRAM is decent, but the problem for me is just the starting price. When I reviewed the RX 7600 about 8 months ago now, I said it really needed to cost no more than $230 US, and I stand firmly behind that claim. My hope was that the 16GB version would step in and match the price of the RTX 4060, essentially eliminating the GeForce competition at that price point. But at $330 US, it's rather an expensive entry-level GPU, and the argument could be made that the 6700 XT for around $340 US right now is a better deal. It also doesn't shut down the RTX 4060, which will remain a viable option, delivering similar performance and value with generally better ray tracing performance, though I do question how useful RT support is at this performance tier. There's also the Arc A770 16GB for $300, which is a seriously good deal, though it might come with a few headaches as we're yet to test an Arc GPU in a reasonable range of games and not have it run into at least one annoying problem, but things are certainly getting better on that front. At the end of the day, the 7600 XT is another frustrating release from AMD, as they once again just managed to miss the mark. Had they released this thing at $300 US, it would have matched the value of the 6700 XT, coming in a little bit slower, but also a bit cheaper, with a bit more VRAM. It would have eliminated the RTX 4060, and while it might have done the same to the $270 RX 7600, they could have either discounted or discontinued that product. Really, what AMD should have done here was release the RX 7600 at $300 8 months ago but with 16 gigabytes of memory. I mean, ideally, I would have wanted that product at $270, but given what we ended up getting, I think a 16 gigabyte model for $300 8 months ago would have been a much better option for everyone. Well, everyone but Nvidia. So while it is nice to have more options, and I really do prefer the 16 gigabyte 7600 XT to that of the 8 gigabyte 7600, I think it's going to be a much better investment, this particular product. It's also not necessarily a product that I would highly recommend, and it's certainly still a toss-up between something like this and the RTX 4060, which is a bit of a shame because AMD really could have shut the door on Nvidia at this price point. So with that, let me know what you think about the 7600 XT in the comments section below, and of course I will be reading your feedback and taking that on board for future evaluations. For now, we are done with this one. If you liked the video, you know what to do. Subscribe for more content, because believe it or not, we have more new GPU content coming up on the channel very shortly, so you're not going to want to miss that. Also, we have Floatplane Patreon if you want more hardware unbox goodness. Signing up to either one of those things will give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&As, behind the scenes content, a lot of cool stuff there, so check that out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to just thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, then yeah, we really do appreciate you, so good job there. But yeah, nothing else to say really other than I'm your host Steve, and I will see you again next time.